people who said, no, we don't need it because, purists and all that. Finally, the community decides, and they finally said, okay, result type is a good thing. So now we have result type. So it's an enum, and you get a success or a failure. And the success is anything that you want, and a failure is basically an error message. So it is errors. You can actually kind of enum or subclass the error, the Swift error, and have it your way. And they also have another function called get, which lets you know what is the actual error. Then you have future enum cases. Now, if you worked with enum and Swift, even in the earlier ones, if you had 3 or 4 cases, if you did not handle all of them, it would give you that all cases are not handled. So the easy thing was default and then let everything be handled by default. The problem is, let's say you had A, B, and C, and you put a default for, you handled case A, you handled case B, and you put a default for everything else, and then you add D, E, and F. What happens now? Everything is being handled by default. So if you put unknown default, what it does is it gives you an error saying that it's just a warning, sorry, not an error. It gives you a warning saying that you have not, it's not exhaustive. You've not looked through all the switch cases. So it's a good way of actually looking at it. And even 4.2, if you use unknown, it doesn't give you anything. It just gives you a warning. The other thing they have now with this is flattening. So when you take an optional, so this is a good example. If you take let Q as try harbor boat. So because you're trying optionally, it'll give you an optional, right? And then if you actually have another one, which is an optional boat, which actually returns an optional, you get a double optional, which means that if you want to unwrap it, you have to unwrap it twice. So it's a bit complicated, and you go like, why would you do that? Well, that's what it was. So now they've actually fixed it, so that you actually get flattened optionals as a result with try. I'm sure you've all at some point done the fizz buzz if you've gone for an interview. And the way to do it is with the modulus. So instead of using the percentage or finding out if it's a multiple of, there's a new function called isMultiple, and you can actually put in a number. So you can actually see if the number is a multiple of the other integer that you're after. And it's much more readable, it's much more clearer than actually using a percentage sign or anything. So it's just about readability. So Swift is moving not just towards functionality, also towards readable code and nice, cleaner code. Then you have transforming and unwrapping dictionaries. Now this compactMapValues. So what it does 2 things for you. One, it does a compact map, which means it removes the nils. And then it also says, leave my directory KeyValuePairs. So if it's removed, but keep them and map it. So here's an example. That's not me. If it was a string, A and B is nil. So when you actually go through compact map, you get A and C. So one more thing, if you actually feel you must try these, Paul Hudson, heard of him? That's Hacking with Swift. And even on the Swift page, swift.org, they recommend trying his playground. So he's got a nice comprehensive document which actually lets you look at the different examples. Strings. Now, raw strings is an amazing thing. And actually, when I was writing this slide, I remember the last presentation I made was on strings. That was when Swift 4-point-something was released. Now, what happens is you can have the 3 quotations and then put your string big block in it. But look at the example. The first one is note/r/n. So what happens is that when you put something like that in a normal string, it would actually break and come to the next line. So looking at the Python side of things where they put a hash, you can actually have, the first one is basically the new model, where if you have the hash at this front, it would not break the characters, and you can have the literal characters in there. So even if you have double slashes, it will show as double slashes. While in the second one with the triple quotes, if you have a /r or /n, which is new line or next line, it will actually break it up. So when you print, it will actually show you broken characters. So if you're using formatting or something, it's quite useful and handy. String interpolation. Now this is something really, really sweet. So what happens is, I'm sure you have tried, when you try printing an object in a string format, like this is, and then the object with a slash and open brackets, you actually get this is and the name of the object and something. So if it's a class, it will tell you the underscore underscore LDB something. And if it's a structure, it will give you all the members of the structure. Now, with this, the best part is you can actually write your own string interpolations. So you can format how you want that particular thing to be. All you need is you need to set this extension and add a function called append interpolation. And if you do that, you're all good. Now, here's an example. So you can use a mutating function. And if you see, yep, this one has a value which is users. That means you can actually overload the function with different parameters, and it'll actually work accordingly. So here we are actually passing a user, and we're saying my name is value.name and value.age. So user is basically a structure or a class which has two members. And in this example, we are sending it a string and an int. So we are actually replicating it. So when you say the song shalala 3 times, it'll actually format it 3 times. So this is really interesting if you want to actually format strings. There's some new character properties. So character as such was kind of useful and similarly useless, because the moment you go to character, you can't do a lot of things. So you have to actually kind of string it to then again make uppercase, lowercase, and whatnot. So now a character actually has a lot of useful properties. You can actually even check, is it a number, is it a symbol, is it a hexa value, or even get the hex value if it's a character which is A to E, or F actually. Yeah, you can even check if it's a whole number or a hex, as I said before. The same thing they've also extended for Unicode scalars. Now, what happens is in the normal English ASCII values, they're characters, but the moment you go into different languages which use more than one character for a language, so it's like if you take the German language, you have the umlaut, which is still 1 because it's ASCII. But the moment you go to Chinese, Hebrew, Arabic, or any of the other languages which are actually Unicode and take a lot more, you don't know if that is one character or is it a string of characters which make that one grapheme or one lexicon. So you can actually do Unicode scalars, and they have their own functions like strings, which is useful because you don't have to translate between strings and characters and Unicode scalars. So you actually have all that functionality through. Removing subsequences. Now, in the past, when you actually took a slice, you would get from a sequence, you would get a subsequence. And the point was that even if you took a portion of a string, you get a substring, and it's kind of frustrating because you have to then again translate it back to a string or whatever. But now, and I don't have an example because I found it flaky, and I'll be honest, I couldn't really work much with it. And I spent about 3 minutes on that, so. So what it does now, it actually gives you an element rather than the substring. So it gives you the sequence rather than a subsequence. So they've removed these subsequences. Dynamic callable. Now if you see, the author is actually Chris Lattner, and you know that he's with Google, and he is quite passionate about Python. So with 4.2, we had the dynamic member lookup. Anybody use that? It's a cool thing. So if you have an array and you try to actually, if you have a structure or a class and you try to access a member, you can't because the compiler says, no, you can't because it's not there in there, because that's the whole idea of the static compiler. But with dynamic lookup, you can actually mark that as a dynamic member lookup, and you can have whatever you want. So your class or structure may not have .new, but you can actually say it's dynamic, which means you will provide it somewhere. So to that extent, now you have a new one, which is called, So now you have dynamic callable. So you can actually call a function dynamically, which basically is, again, for interoperating with Python. So all you need to do is you need to have a function called dynamically call. And you can have two options, which is with arguments or with keyword arguments. So with arguments is not named parameters, and with arguments is basically, with keyword arguments is KeyValuePairs. Sorry. So if you call, for example, C1, it's just with arguments and you have nothing. C1 and 2, it basically passes 1 and 2 as arguments. And if you call C and then A1, which is basically the named arguments, it doesn't work because you have not called it with named arguments. So when you call it with keyword arguments, you can actually use named arguments. So it's quite interesting, but then I have not found, personally, I have not found the interoperability between Python or using it in any other form. So while it is really useful, I don't know, I can't tell much about why and how. Then they've actually changed dictionary literals to key value pairs because they said dictionary literals are not dictionaries, they're not literals. So why call them dictionary literals? So again, reiterating the fact that on the Swift evolution, the community does talk about things, how it is relevant, is it readable? There's a whole lot of discussion on should it be, there was a Boolean thing. It was like, should it be toggle, should it be switch, should it be on, off, or whatnot. So yeah, I mean, you ask for opinions, you'll get a lot of opinions. So finally, they're calling it key value pairs, and which basically is you can define literally a dictionary, but it's not a dictionary because when you look into what type it is, it's still a key value pair. Sorry?
Dictionary is just a dictionary, or what is it?
So dictionary is basically, you have to define, it's a string. In very simple terms, a dictionary is a string any. You can have a dictionary of string and string, but by default, I mean, a dictionary is a string any.
String to string. Is that addition string to string, right?
You can have anything, it's generic.
Should evaluate the type automatically since you put string to int or string to int?
Oh, yes. But it should be similar, that's all. Yep. Then you have identity key paths. Now, this is the other one from the 3 minutes that I actually spent on trying to look at the things that didn't work. This is the other one. So you have something called self, which is an interesting thing, which kind of didn't make sense in the past. You're like, what is x.self? But you have a new property called self, so you can actually use it in key paths. This example is exactly the one on Swift evolution because I couldn't make the other ones work. So you can actually try this. You assign x the value of 5. You print x.self, it will give you 5. You assign x.self as 3, and you print x, it will still give you. So it's basically .self is the same as the actual value. But make a note, this is lowercase self, because in 5.1, there's an uppercase self, which is, I'll come to that at the end. If you use Codable, JSON for encoding and decoding, now ranges are yoo-hoo. I don't know where you're going to use them, but yeah, ranges are. So yoo-hoo, good for it. Sorry, Rob?
I've used that one. It's long overdue.
Okay. Now, I have not come across a use case, so I can't talk about that use case. Right. Now, platform dependent. So with the package manager, now Ankit Angarwal is one of the guys who's really passionate about the package manager, and he's done a lot of tickets on there. So one of the things is platform dependent settings. So you can actually have a package and you can say package, these are the platforms, these are the versions. And if you look at them, they are all enums. So you can't make mistakes. You can when the new version comes out, but yeah. You have target build settings. So just like the settings files in the past, you can have a long, big settings file. So package manager, think of it as one replacement for CocoaPods if you want. Think of it as the Apple or the iOS version of Gradle or Maven, if I can be bold to say that. So now it's actually kind of picking up more. So you can actually have settings. So you want the Swift settings, linker settings, C settings or C++ settings. And you can even have functions like when, and you can have some kind of condition saying that this should happen only when this condition is fulfilled. Dependency mirroring, which is also an interesting one. It's basically using mirrors for your package. So you can have it on an alternate site. One other thing you have now is the less than. So in the past, they only had greater than or equals to. So you would have if not greater than or equal to Swift 4.2, but now you can say if less than Swift 5. So it gives you both ways. I mean, I don't use that as much because, but if you do, then it's really helpful. Now, these are some of the things which are in 5.1, which is still beta. So when they get released, we can talk about it. One of the things is universal self. So if you have a structure or a class, and in your closure or when you're actually accessing it from outside, it's something like dynamic self. So instead of using dynamic self, you can actually use self now. But this one is with the capital S, not a small s. They have ordered collection diffing. So if you have collections, you can actually see what are the differences. So you have two arrays or two sets, you can see the diff. And it will tell you if it is actually to be removed or added. So you actually get a kind of a collection which says these are to be removed, these are to be added. So what is the difference between these two, which is really useful in some cases. And then you have creating uninitialized arrays. So when you create arrays, this one's a bit tricky. I'll leave that.
So you can create array with nils, right?
Yes, you can do that even now. You don't have to.
So now is the problem.
Yes, they're optional, yes. But the only problem is that when you create uninitialized arrays, you're also setting a size. That's why it's tricky. I have not read a lot into it, so I won't be talking much about it. That's why this is just a point on it. Yeah. And yeah, thank you for your patience and hearing me out. Question time.
You forgot to mention about universal library, as far as you know, Swift 5 has universal library, which comes with the device.
That's the ABI compatibility. So the whole Swift library is actually part of the OS now.
Yeah, now the question.
Yes.
If you have a library inside your app, will it automatically read out by installer?
I don't think so.
No.
What is the
ABI
preference?
stability
Because
for libraries comes in 5.1.
currently you can't get away. The library might be there. There's an option, skip library, only for Objective-C model, not for a Swift model. The Swift model library automatically bundles.
I think you have to recompile it, and there will be some settings which kind of
So you
thins it.
your minimum target must be iOS 12.2 or whatever it is.
In this case, it will be
No, it'll be 13, I guess, Rob, because that's 13 is where you have the. Sorry, 12. What am I saying? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so you've got to raise your minimum target. If you're still supporting iOS 10, iOS 10 doesn't have Swift 5, so it can't use the ABI stability, so it still needs to bundle all of the built-in libraries. But ABI stability for your own sheet frameworks comes in 5.1.
But isn't the Swift library DLL file? It should be separate. It should be easy to read out.
If you target iOS 12.2 or above,
It's just that if you have backwards compatibility, you need to have the library.
yeah, if you're shipping for iOS 11, iOS 11 doesn't know about the
It supports iOS 9 even.
Yeah.
Yes?
A lot of conversation I see happening around Swift 5 and Swift 5.1, people often talking about the features that didn't happen in Swift 5 and Swift 5.1, namely the dropping of count where as a feature, people often arguing about whether the string library in Swift is sufficient or if there's a lot of work left. Is there anything that you personally would have liked to see in Swift 5 or would like to see in Swift 5.1 from like a day-to-day developer perspective?
Good question. I don't have an answer for you, really. For a simple reason is that I am not using it to the extent that I should be. I'm satisfied at the moment with Swift 4.2. Yes, there are shortcomings, but we are not really kind of pushing it to the edges. So we haven't really reached that stage where like I should have had that. And what happens is over a period of time, you make your own utilities and libraries, so you kind of like have a fix for it. And sometimes they work much better than waiting for something which is, so once it gets formalized, we might use that. So personally, that's my take.
Any more questions?
This is kind of the other side of that question. Like, do you think that some things like count where have a kind of a waste of time for the Swift core developers to be thinking about, and they should just leave that to people to add in their own extensions, etc.?
I think count where was deprecated, if memory serves me right. Now the point is,
I think the broader question is, are there some trivial things creeping in, do you think?
I mean, is it a waste of time? I don't know. It's an open source. It's a community thing. So if more people feel that one way, then that's exactly how the community feels, and that's what exactly the thing is. So far, Apple had been known as the walled garden. They would never let other people play in that space. But now it's open. So, I mean, there are a lot of things which might not even make sense. There would be other pressing things, but they only take up the ones that people vote and kind of think is important. I mean, half the things, the changes with the syntax might not even be important. But, well, I mean, there's a discussion on it. So is it a waste of time? I'd be diplomatic here and say that's what the community believes.
Any more questions?
Hi. I didn't play with Swift5 yet, so but I was confused about using .self, and I know we can use capital self right now. So .self will give like a type, because capital self it is itself giving a type, isn't it?
Capital self is more referring to the class or the structure, the dynamic type, while the dot self is not the type, it is actually the variable itself. And the reason for that is basically for using key paths. So you can use the slash dot self, which is the key path, which refers to the same variables. You can use them in square brackets, which is like what do you call, I'm missing the word. As a subscript now. What's that thing? No, it's just like how you use dictionaries. So you can actually use the square brackets and you can have a path in it. So key path, and then you pass the key path.
Swift equivalent of KeyValue coding is key paths. They had a gap there that is you couldn't reference the object itself in a key path.
So it's the value of that object rather than the object.
Any more? I think it's good to note down the Swift evolution numbers, because there will be a very long discussion thread in the forums about each of those if you want any background on how they reached the decision.
Okay. Then thank you. If there are no more questions.